Thank you so much. I'm going to invite Dr. Ellison to get her slides ready. And as she's doing that, I will introduce her. And thank you again, Dr. Wing. So Dr. Brenna Ellison studies how people make food choices, particularly how consumers use information in their food choice decisions in order to promote consumer health and well-being. She has done quite a bit of work to understand college food insecurity, and today she'll be sharing her qualitative results on how college students understand the household food security module questions. So welcome, Dr. Ellison.
Okay, thank you, Meg, and thanks so much for organizing this event on such an important topic. I'm not going to turn on my video because I think it's not allowed in case we have a really big group. Meg, can you see the slides?
Yes, we can see the slides.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we're going to switch gears a little bit here, and what I'd like to talk about is how do college students actually interpret the food security survey module questions that Meg introduced and then Dr. Wing also kind of talked about. And so what we did is actually some qualitative work interviewing college students to understand how they think about these questions. So I'm trying to advance my slides. There we go. Before I get going, I just want to quickly recognize our project team. This was work that Cassandra Nicolaus, she's now a postdoc at Washington State University, but this was part of her dissertation work. And so myself and Shelley Nichols Richardson at the University of Illinois were her co-advisors. And so I'm happy to share this work with you. So real quickly, most of us are familiar, but in the event that you're not, rates of food insecurity in the US, pre-COVID levels, 10.5% in 2019 and just a little over 11% in 2018. Yet there's been multiple college student population studies and recent reviews. Meg and I have both done separate reviews, and we're getting average prevalence estimate rates of 35 to 51%. Obviously, this is a concern because food insecurity is associated with a number of negative outcomes, such as, compromised dietary quality, physical health, mental health, and then also academic success in the college population. But despite the increasing evidence and increasing studies out there on this topic, there are some pretty big critiques of the college food insecurity literature. One of the big ones that you hear from people who are maybe arguing for a focus in different areas is that many of these studies have non-representative convenience-based samples. There's others that critique the low response rates. Some say that they're lacking rigor of peer review. This is mostly when studies are coming out of centers, maybe through white papers or reports, but not necessarily going through the peer review process. And then the last thing that is a critique is varying measurements and definitions of food insecurity. I would say there is some variation. The majority are using some form of the USDA measure that Meg went over at the beginning. But there is a lot of variation into what people are doing, what time reference they're using, whether they're using 6, 10 item, 18 item, and so on. And so the question that we have, are the current food insecurity measures suitable for this population? And someone might ask, why would we even question this measure at all? And so one thing that is important to note is that the USDA food security measures have not been validated for the college student population. 2 studies have shown that the food insecurity data does not fit the underlying RASH model that we just heard about. So that part of our research here at the University of Illinois, but also some research out of the University of Arkansas has found similar things. And then part of the work coming out of Meg's lab, 1 in 4 students on an unlimited meal plan reported experiencing food insecurity. And so I just wanted to also share some data we have from here on campus. This is data that we have. It's unpublished, but we asked meal plan holders specifically the 6-item food insecurity questions. And so what you'll see is that 43% of students with meal plans, these aren't unlimited, but they are meal plans, self-identified as food insecure using the 6-item USDA module. So the reason we got into this space in general is it just there seemed to be a lot of things out there that suggested maybe students think about food insecurity differently than the general adult population, or maybe they're thinking about the questions in a way that we're not aware of. So our big picture research question is, how do students interpret the USDA Food Security Survey module questionnaire items? So how we recruited participants, we did cognitive interviews with 33 students. We did, for the purposes of our study, restrict it to what would be, I guess, deemed more traditional college students between the ages of 18 to 24. These students were recruited from a previous online survey that we did. So we, at the end of that survey, students could sign up for future studies. And what we did is randomly invited students from the group that had signed up for future studies. We recruited a mix of both food secure and food insecure students. In our interviewing process, we reached saturation with food secure students very quickly. There wasn't much variation in how they interpreted questions. So instead of having an even number of both, we decided to actually recruit additional food insecure students because there seemed to be much more variation in their interpretations. Interviews in general, we tried to conduct them within 1 month of the online survey in hopes that we would be comparing consistency of online and in-person responses, and to hope that their situation had not changed so dramatically between the two surveys. So each interview is approximately a 60-minute session, and students were compensated for their time. So when students came to interview, they first completed the 10-item food security module. And then an interviewer asked participants a series of questions about each item. And I should say that when they filled out the module, we took that from them, and then we got out a blank copy of the module to have them look at if they wanted to reference it. So for each of the 10 questions, which I'll show you in a second, you've already seen once from Meg, but I'll remind you of them. First, we just asked, how did you go about answering this question? So kind of having them think aloud and talk through the process of how they answered it. How easy or difficult was it to answer the question? How did you feel about answering the question? This was to assess whether there was any sort of emotional response to the question itself. And then we also asked about how confident they were in their answer. And then for some questions, we very specifically asked students how they interpreted key terms such as balanced meal, before I got money to buy more, and food didn't last. So here is the 10-item food security module. So these are the 10 questions that Meg showed you earlier. The questions with asterisks are just to denote if you only did the 6 items, those were the questions that you would ask. And here is the scoring for the 10-item module. So this is more general knowledge. We weren't really looking to classify students in this particular study, but this is just how the scoring works. And so for our interview coding approach, all transcripts were coded and analyzed by 2 researchers. We started with independent open coding to identify new concepts. And then after about 10 interviews that were open coded by both researchers, we agreed on a working code book to use for coding the remaining interviews, updated it as needed, and then we did several rounds of review and coding to ensure inter and intra-rater reliability. To give you a quick summary of the students that participated in our study, we did have more female than male participants. On average, they were just a little bit over 19 years of age. So we still had a good distribution across the different classifications. We were a little underrepresented on seniors in general, and probably a little bit overrepresented on freshmen based on the U of I statistics. Predominantly white, and we also had about 20% students who identified as Asian in terms of race, which is also consistent with university demographics. And about a quarter of our participants were considered first-generation students. So here are kind of the summaries of the different questions that we asked. So from the RASH model, the one thing that we do know is that in general, affirmative responses should decline because we're going from least severe to most severe. And so in this particular case, I don't know, I think I might be able to draw on our screen, but affirmative responses are the sometimes true, often true, at least for these first few questions. And then they switch to yes and those sorts of things. So affirmative responses are in like the kind of darker green and blue colors. But what you'll notice is we do see the most affirmative responses for this balanced meal question right here, which is the third question. So it jumps in an unpredictable way. And we also see that the subsequent questions after it still have more affirmative responses for about the next 2 or 3 than what we did for these original questions. So it doesn't appear that it's following the expected model well. The other thing I would want to highlight for this population in particular, this is AD4, which as you'll see here is the, did you lose weight because you didn't have enough money for food? 27% said they didn't know, and I'll mention it later, but a lot of this is a function of whether or not students own or have access to a scale. Most of them just didn't know what they weighed. So some general observations from our interviews. Several students found it challenging to remember what happened in the last 30 days. We had several cases where students reported kind of generalizing their responses to either the last 1 to 2 weeks, or they just thought about the current semester, because students very much think in semester terms based on courses. In some cases, students completely overlook the time reference. So in this study, we used in the last 30 days, some just, you know, when they were talking through the question, it was very evident like that did not occur to them, and on additional probing, you know, admitted that they didn't see that part of the question. More often though, we saw students overlooking the qualifying monetary statements. So as an example, at the end of this question here, did you ever cut the size of your meals or skip meals because there wasn't enough money for food? On multiple occasions during our interviews, we had students who, when they were asked to go through the question out loud and talk about it, they had answered it in a way that would affirm food insecurity. But then when they talk through it, they're like, oh, well, it's actually because I don't have time, not because I don't have money. And so there were some that made that realization up front, and then there was others who, when they were talking through it, realized that happened. And then in several cases during the interview, students could not remember how they answered items just 5 to 10 minutes before. So I don't really have an explanation for why that happened, other than to say that it did happen. So I think there's more work to do there. So what I want to show you first is some interpretation of key terms. And so the big term that we're looking at here is money. And so these are all answers of different ways that students interpret money, which I think is super interesting, particularly in the college student context. So in some cases, it's about having a job. It's just what's in your bank account. For many students, it was related to their meal plan or credits that they have on campus. For some, it was, you know, what they get from student loans, or maybe what they get from their parents. So there is a lot of different ways that students thought about money. But then you'll notice that some, they might just only think about one of those. Many of them had access to multiple, but for the purposes of the questions, would tell us, you know, that I'm just thinking about this because it's easier to think about. And that most often happened with meal plans for those students who had one. And for this one, we asked about balanced meals. That's kind of the key term we're talking about. We got a lot of pretty traditional responses. A lot of students went back to the food pyramid or My Plate. Most of them still reference the food pyramid, which was kind of funny to us. But they would talk about, you know, you need to have protein, fruits, vegetables, carbohydrates, those sorts of things. But, you know, some people talked about it just in terms of calories. But there are some really interesting answers too, which, you know, we found as evidence that maybe not everyone's interpreting it the way it was intended. So these two right here, I just don't like spending so much money on super healthy things because I feel like they're really expensive. So that's not necessarily saying they can't afford balanced meals, but they prefer not to spend their money that way. I don't want to go out to buy all these ingredients. It's such a hassle. So that's why I can't afford to eat balanced meals. So again, both of these responses in particular answered in a way that would suggest they were experiencing food insecurity. But when we read these interpretations, it's not necessarily monetary constraints. It's just it's expensive and they don't want to spend their money that way, or perhaps it's inconvenient. So some other insights. We found that students had difficulty distinguishing between some items, in particular, cutting the size or skipping meals. most students felt like was very similar to did you ever eat less than you felt you should. So on multiple occasions, students that said they skipped meals or cut the size of their meals said, of course, then that means I ate less than I felt I should. So they had some trouble distinguishing that. And as I mentioned before, several students did not know their weight or had no access to a scale. So it's unclear how informative this particular question is in the college student population. Some other insights that were interesting to us is actually in relation to the question about were you ever hungry but didn't eat because there wasn't enough money for food. It was mostly interesting for the food insecure responses because many of those food insecure students brought up a question of what real hunger is and would often discount their own hunger. So these are just two quotes. People usually associate "are you hungry" with homeless, and the hungry, you gotta feed the hungry and the poor. So this person was talking more about like, I'm not really hungry, like real hunger is what homeless people experience, not me. And then the next student talked about like 24 hours is like hungry. I feel like if I don't wait that long, then I'm not really, then it's like you're just a little bit hungry. So on multiple occasions, these students would, really suggest like, I'm fine. And we saw in multiple cases where students who their experiences were telling us they're very much experiencing food insecurity, but they did not want to identify that way. So where do we go from here? We do find evidence that some questionnaire items may not be interpreted as expected, but what I would say is it's happening in both directions. So while I showed some cases where students are answering affirmatively such that they would be identified as food insecure, but their interpretation suggests that they're actually food secure, we did see that, but we also saw the other direction. So there were students answering negatively in a food secure pattern, but their interpretation would suggest they are actually experiencing food insecurity. In particular, related to balanced meals, we saw many students, or not many, but we saw a few students. We had one student who was a biochemistry major who was very quick to tell us like how a can of beans from a biochemical nutritional perspective was completely a balanced meal and that she regularly ate just a can of beans. And so I would also say these interviews just generally were emotionally like, very interesting and difficult to process at times. So the big picture question, is there value in modifying the food security module for this population? I would say this is not a popular question. I think most people would prefer to leave it where it is. However, if we were going to think about it, how would we do it? I think some critical points here for the college student population in particular, if you wanted to pursue this route, defining money is much harder with this population compared to the general US population. Students have a lot of different potential food and financial resources that need to be accounted for. And a lot of them rely on free food events, which is completely different. It's not money, right? But it is food and it counts towards how they're accessing food. Another critical point in this population seems to be disaggregating monetary versus time constraints on food access. Both are very real constraints. However, as food insecurity is traditionally defined, it's very much based on monetary constraints to food access, not necessarily time. So that's not to say that time constraints aren't important, but as of right now, that's not recognized as a reason that someone could not access food and be considered food insecure. But to me, there's room for the discipline to change their thinking on that if it seems like something we need to do. With that, that's kind of the quick summary of our work. If you have questions, please feel free to email me on the screen, and I'm also happy to answer questions from the chat or in the Q&A box.
Thank you for your talk, Brenna. We can take questions now from the audience. So Brenna, can you talk through any sort of immediate next steps from this work?
Right. Well, so one thing, we're interested in doing is kind of talking through like testing a new measure. Would it work? Does it perform differently? That's something, we really would like to do. We also would like to do more work and I've been talking with Meg about this too, really comparing this in-person versus online surveying. And we didn't do a very good job at doing them close enough together to feel confident in the comparison of those results. But given that so many of these college food insecurity studies are done with online surveys, it would be useful to kind of understand how well those results compare to when you do it in person, because like the census and those sorts of current population survey, a lot of times are based on in-person or phone interviews, which is actually quite different.
There's you kind of alluded to it, but maybe be a little bit more explicit. Has an alternative module been developed in any way, or is it in process for students?
To my knowledge, there is not one developed in any way yet for students. I think Meg and I would really like to do it, but there is currently not a module there. Yes.
And I'll say I know I'm aware of some other groups that are working on it. BYU is doing some work on this, and so probably forthcoming. Rebecca asks, what about the 2-item hunger vital sign that is recommended for pediatric use? So some overlap with early post-secondary students. Seems like it may not accurately capture FI, food insecurity, in this population.
Right, so I personally have not used the hunger vital sign. I know Meg has used this measure in her research. I know from talking with folks at USDA and Matt Rabbit, who couldn't end up being here, I know that that's definitely not recommended from a USDA perspective. They've not officially weighed in on the college student capacity, but in general, I think they support more items to less in terms of, you know, feeling good about or feeling confident in the results that you're getting. I don't know, Meg, if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, I think so. We've done some test retest on the 2-item measure, and it is pretty, it's okay. But the more I learn about food insecurity measurement within college students, I'm less and less comfortable using the 2-item, and probably wouldn't do anything less than the 10-item moving forward. But given the issues that Brenna raised, I'm not even sure what we're measuring with food insecurity with college students. There's something different about the how students are responding to these questions, because we still see, you know, there's been hundreds of articles in the past 5 years on this, and we still see that food insecure students report higher levels of stress, higher levels of anxiety, poor dietary quality, but we don't know exactly how. I mean, Brenna is showing how they may be responding to these questions, so we're not sure what's different about the students that report higher levels of food insecurity. Is it really food insecurity? Is it something else, something combined with food insecurity? There's just a lot of questions that we have still. Catherine asked, have you looked at food insecurity using these questions among college students during COVID?
So that's a great question. I personally have not attempted to do any surveys during COVID. Our campus is pretty strict right now on what we can do in terms of research and bugging students, because they're getting so many emails from an all online semester. However, I do know there's at least one paper that came out published in Nutrients that's out of Texas, where they were surveying students during COVID. I'm quite sure there's got to be several more under review, but I personally do not have any research in that area, and that's the only study I've seen published out recently.
I think there's quite a bit coming out, so keep posted.
Yeah, that's my guess.
Isabel asks, what is the impact that meal plans play in student food insecurity, extrapolated from your specific responses that you received?
Right. So that's a good question. Meal plans, at least at Illinois, are really interesting. We have the students who are on them in general. A lot of students, I would say, had a hard time answering the questions because of meal plans. So meal plans create issues in interpretation in that sometimes they're only open certain hours. And so they didn't feel like they should answer in a way that would suggest they are food insecure, because they're like, well, I have a meal plan, I have access to food, but I can't go when the dining halls are open. So that kind of is an issue, one. Two, they may not like the foods at the dining hall, or they may not be appropriate from a cultural perspective, from what they prefer to eat. So it is really tricky. And I think on the whole, people that maybe are averse to this literature and what it's saying have issues, especially at big schools that have meal plans, and just think that these things can't coexist. And I think the reality is they can, but they do create challenges in terms of interpretation. Money and meal plan are not typically synonymous, and so it does create some interpretational issues. And so I think if you were to build a new module, you might think about having branches. I know that creates difficulty, but I do think students that have meal plans might should be asked questions in a way that asks them about specifically their meal plan, or to consider their meal plan plus other resources, because just letting students kind of guess which one to focus on isn't really producing the best results, in my opinion.
And then Michael asked, are there constructs not included in the USDA module that you would include to better measure food security among college students? If so, what are they?
So it's a hard question. We've thought about this a lot. I think still one of the big things for us, I'm not sure it's a construct as much as like just tweaking how the questions are asked, but I think trying to better outline the potential ways that students can get food and to think about the whole of them and not just one. Just money in general is a problem. And I think it is really critical to disaggregate time versus monetary constraints. Also, again, both are very real. And when I've presented this work for seminars at other campuses, students will argue and say, but it's because I don't have time, and that should matter too. And it's not that I don't think that it does, but it is different than how food insecurity is defined. And so I think, we need to have a bigger conversation in the discipline about that issue.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Ellison, for such a great talk. I don't think there are any more questions, so we'll transition to our next speaker.